Walt Disney. I love Walt Disney so much. Walt Disney.
Welcome to Thought Crime and Keto Crime, where Tracy does the sleuthing so you don't have to.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Thought Crime and Keto Crime. Welcome to one I'm very excited about, the Walt Disney story. This will probably be divided into 2 major parts and 4 subparts. I'll put timestamps down below for each part. Number 1 will be background and early years. Second part will be roughly the 1920s and 30s. Then the third part will be 40s and 50s. And then the last part will be 50s on into late 50s on into the 60s up until his death. I'm going to stop at Walt Disney's death. I think we all can kind of imagine how far the Walt Disney Company has come since his death, since most of us grew up, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, 90s on this channel. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to cover all of that. I will stop at his death. But I think it's important to see where he came from, because he endured a lot of hardship to bring the joy that he has to the whole world. And I am a huge Disney fan. I love Walt Disney. I grew up with it. My favorite movie to date is still Snow White. The original, I don't know why. I just think it was just unique animation. I fell in love with it. I think the 7 Dwarfs were just great. Doc has always been my favorite. And I just love it. Now, after that, I love lots. I love Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Lion King, definitely. So many of them. So many of them. I really, beyond Snow White, I don't think I could pick my favorite. I mean, I must have watched Walt Disney's rendition of Robin Hood, where, Robin Hood was portrayed by anamorphic animals, 100 times. In fact, it was that movie that got me turned on to C.S. Lewis and got me into the Chronicles of Narnia and the original animated version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which took me into the modern, reading all those books and the modern versions of it. And then from there, it took me into the wonderful world into J.R.R. Tolkien and The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and then into those wonderful movies by Peter Jackson. That could have been a little shorter, but we won't go into that. And then from there, of course, I got into Game of Thrones, and my geekdom has no end. So anyway, you'll see that it was Walt Disney that laid the foundation for that. And I hope you're going to enjoy this as much as I will. First of all, a little housekeeping. Thank you so much. I can't use as many clips during this as I would like to because of copyright. But I have found some open source, some, copyright-free clips that I can use. I hope you enjoy them. And I will also, will be telling as much of the story as I can. The history on Walt Disney is kind of muddled. I read 3 books, watched 2 very long documentaries, one of them from the actual Disney family, and as well as tons of articles and other things about Walt Disney. And there's always a little bit of conflict, and I'll bring up those points of contention when I'm covering them, because I don't know for sure, but I'll try to put forth as much of the Disney story as I can. Also, if you like the channel, please subscribe, comment, hit that like button for the YouTube algorithm. That's the most important thing you can do for the channel. If you'd like to become one of my patrons or otherwise support the channel, below, there's links for that below. I would like to give a shout out to my wonderful, wonderful patrons: the luscious Lauren Kirk, the stupendous Sarah Carney, the awesome Andrea Lee, the tenacious Tabora Summers Cooper, the stupendous Stephanie Mertz, and the dynamite Demelzo Pascal. Thank you so much for everything that you do. Couldn't do it without you. We have a good time over there. You get behind the scenes videos. There's going to be a monthly live stream with patrons only starting this month, because believe it or not, it's August 1st. And yeah, it's a good time. But, financial support goes right back into the channel to make it better. I do have 2 day jobs that kind of take care of my My money situation, this is more of a love and a passion. If it becomes a full-time career later on, great. That just means I'll never work a day in my life. But everything that you contribute goes back into the channel, but it's never required, always appreciated. Thank you so much. And with that, let's get into part 1, early years and background on the Disney family.
Oh my, here's Tracy with part 1.
Elias Disney met Flora Call in Florida, about 50 miles away from Orlando, where many years later one of their son's greatest resorts and achievements, Universal Studios, Disney World, and Epcot Center, would be centered. And they met because Elias, who at that time was working as a citrus farmer after having flunked out of being a salesperson in corporate America, had set up shop. Flora's father lived next door to her, where Elias had kind of come to rest. And they started courting, which was how it was done in the late 19th century. This was in 1888. They married quite quickly after meeting and proceeded to set up shop as a citrus farmer. In fact, it wasn't long before their first son, Herbert Arthur Disney, was born December 6, 1888, followed exactly 1 year later by Raymond Arnold Disney, December 30th, 1890. And from there, Elias Disney realized he was kind of failing as a citrus farmer. One thing you have to remember about Elias, he, like his son Walt, was an innovator, a serial entrepreneur who always wanted to make it. But unlike Walt, who stuck to one thing, art, drawing, cartooning, Elias, if he failed at one thing, he would jump on to what he thought was the next best thing. And this would become a pattern throughout the Disney family's existence, and it would lead to a lot of contention. So, by 1890, he realized that the whole citrus farming thing was not going to work out. And so he took his entire family to Chicago, Illinois, where they settled into a basic middle-class existence with him working a series of different sales and office jobs, and proceeded to raise his family there. They got involved in the church. The Disneys were very religious for most of their lives, and they ended up befriending a local minister by the name of Walter Parr, who would play a very important part in young Walt's life, which we'll talk about. And then in 1893, Roy Oliver Disney was born, and you'll recognize the name Roy Disney because he was Walt's partner throughout the formation of Walt Disney Studios. It wasn't just Walt, it was also Roy. Roy kind of gets a bad name because he ended up being the business brain behind the innovator that was Walt Disney. Walt Disney had the art and the technique down. Roy kept the business grounded and profitable so that it can continue to exist. And so that was Roy's part in it. And with the addition of yet another child, 3 children now, Elias became more and more unstable at home. Now, this is where the first of a couple of contradictions you will find. I found some books that said Elias was aloof but not cruel. And then I had others that said he was both aloof and cruel. So I'm going to try to somewhere meet in the middle. But we'll just say that Elias wasn't very patient. As he was struggling with jobs, jumping from job to job, there was a struggle with money. He was incredibly friendly in public because he believed in networking and meeting people, but he was incredibly harsh at home. Anything that the 3 older boys, Herbert, Raymond, and Roy, did to earn any money as they grew up, and he made all of his children work from the time they could walk. They had something to do, whether it was yard work for the neighbors, delivering newspapers, whatever he could make those children do to earn some money. He took their money and used it for what he said was the benefit of the family, because the children could certainly not be trusted to spend their own money. And so as a result, he was very cordial in public. He had a lot of friends. People liked him, but at home it was an entire 180 turn. He was very aloof, cruel, domineering. He would, according to what I read, beat the children and even beat Flora if he thought she had stepped out of line. Now, Cue my obvious objection to domestic violence in any way, shape, or form. But as I went on, I started to realize how parallel the life of Walt Disney was with the life of Michael Jackson. Now, whatever your fears are about the Jacksons, their father was very domineering, just like Elias Disney. He made them work from the time they were small. They had no semblance of a childhood. Elias did not believe in toys. He did not believe in sweets. He did not believe in allowing children to be children. They were young adults from the time that they could walk, and that's almost the way that the Jackson father pushed his children. They worked from the time they were young, and as a result, you had people with stunted childhoods. Michael Jackson was a child that never grew up, just like you'll learn that Walt Disney was a child that never grew up. He said it himself. He created the wonderful creations he created so that he could have a childhood experience. He created Disneyland so that he would have a play place. He went to Disneyland in Anaheim every morning before he went to the office and rode the train around the grounds, playing with his toys. That's what he always said. He always felt akin to the character of Peter Pan because he felt he was Peter Pan. And so that whole parallel there kind of made me think of Michael Jackson, because Michael Jackson had Netherland. Walt Disney had Disneyland. Now, we all know what happened to Michael Jackson later on. Walt Disney did not go that route, and I'm certainly glad that he didn't, but it's just amazing how the two lives were parallel, and they both went on to bring happiness into the world with their art. And it was during this time period that Walter Parr would come in as a minister. He ministered to the family. He would slip the kids little bits of candy. He would be kind of a warm and nurturing father figure outside of Elias Disney for all the boys, and he was a good friend to Elias. He would help him get jobs. He would counsel him, because I said Elias was always a religious man. And it was into this dynamic that Walter Elias Disney was born December 5th, 1901. It's ironic that the majority of their children were born in December. I don't know what that means, but it was just weird. And if there's any Sagittariuses out there that might have input on that, feel free to drop it down below, because it was just very, very unusual that all their kids, right down to younger sister Ruth, which we will cover in a little while, born December. It's just weird. That's like I was reading the stuff and it just went, ah. Once Walt came along, it is said that Elias got worse, because now he has even more mouths to feed and has no steady job employment. He jumps from one get-rich-quick scheme to the other, one entrepreneurial avenue to another, without really thinking, and kind of drags his family along with him. They were living in the Chicago suburb of Hermosa, Illinois. And again, Walt started to work from the time he was old enough to be able to know what work was. And this was after the arrival of baby sister Ruth Flora Disney, December 6, 1903, so she was exactly 2 years younger than Walt, that things kind of exploded with Elias. Flora, who had been educated before they left Florida, had taught school before, and it was at this point that she kind of stood up to her husband and said, "We need more money. I'm going to work." So she started to teach high school in the local school district. And with this, Elias took that as kind of a, criticism of himself, his lack of ability to provide. And so the abuse got worse, according to the books that I read. He started to be ever more abusive, distant. He spent a lot of time at work. When he would come home, he would literally put them back in line, if you know what I mean. And for the longest time, Roy Disney is stated to have said he thought his mom Flora's spirit was broken. She had no more to give. She'd given birth to 5 children that she loved and nurtured. Flora was a very kind-hearted, loving woman, which leads me to believe that's why Walt Disney, in his movies, you tend to see a kind mother rather than a kind father. It came from his experiences, at least the movies that were produced when he was alive. So just a lot of the psychology behind it started to flow in. But finally, in the late 19 around 1910, everything kind of dried up for the Disneys in the Chicago area, and he moved them to Marceline, Missouri, where he decided again he wanted to farm. His brother Robert Disney was already farming there, and he took up a piece of Elias took up a piece of property next to his brother and started putting the boys to work on the farm. However, Herbert and Raymond weren't having it. They were old enough to stake out on their own, and they pushed back against their father, and they ran off and joined the army to get away from the family. And Walt was devastated by this because he felt that he had been deserted by his two oldest brothers, who would go on later on to fulfill a very important part in his life, but he really did feel deserted. He and Roy and Ruth felt like their whole world was crashing in, as did Flora, because now the family was shattered because of Elias's domineering attitude. So young 7-year-old Walt at this time did the best that he could. He started to live in his own head. He will state this himself. He started to make friends with the animals on the farm. He had a pet pig by the name of Porker, and this would be his muse for the later Three Little Pigs rendition he would do under his Silly Symphonies brand. And he said that the little pigs were very definitely based on Porker, who he talked to, and he said that the pig could talk back to him. I mean, he literally lived in his head. This is like Dr. Dolittle come alive. He also discovered drawing. He loved the comics and the funnies in the Sunday paper, and he would steal the Sunday paper as soon as it came, take the comics out, put it back so his father could have it, and he would run out and sit in the barn. And because his father would not pop for anything that he considered frivolous, no toys, no candy, certainly no art supplies, he had old pencils or bits of charcoal, and he would draw on the bag of old paper grocery sacks or on toilet paper. He would try his best to copy the funny papers and copy the characters he saw to hone his craft. And he actually became quite talented at drawing. And a retired doctor that lived down the road from him actually saw him out sitting one day drawing and asked to see what he was doing. And when he showed him, the doctor took a liking to it and said, "That's very good, son." And he actually gave Walt some pencils and a drawing tablet and said, "I will pay you if you draw some of the animals on my farm. I want you to draw a picture of my horse." And Walt was taken aback. He never realized that people would actually pay him for his drawings. And he was hesitant at first, but then he realized that this doctor was serious, and he felt he owed him for giving him the pencils and the drawing pad. So he actually drew the doctor's horse, and the doctor liked it so much that he paid him for it. But of course, Elias, upon finding the money, took it from him. And Walt was very scared that his father was going to do away with his pencils and his paper, but surprisingly, Elias didn't. He let him keep it, but he told them that any money that came in needed to go for the good of the family. Of course, Walt was less than 10 years old. He had no choice but to comply. And so Walt eventually started school. While at school, he would take his drawing supplies and he would draw for pictures for the other students. He would draw them. He would draw animals. He would draw buildings. He would draw whatever he could, especially trains. He developed a huge love of trains and would run off to see them at any point that he could. And he would draw all these things, and his classmates and teachers would pay him for it. I think that's just amazing that he had such a talent at such a young age. Walt excelled in, of course, art class and literature class, and anything that kind of was an exercise of the right side brain. He excelled at. The other stuff, math, arithmetic, and science, just kind of so-so. I mean, he passed. He was not a stellar student. He himself said he could have tried a lot harder, but he said he kind of was downtrodden because he could never please his father, no matter what he did. I mean, he was selling art to help support the family, and he was going to school. He was passing, but yet nothing was good enough for his father. And eventually, after surprise, surprise, that farm failed because Elias jumped from business sales to citrus farming, and then he did some contracting and then some other stuff in Chicago, failed at that. Now just a wheat farmer. He failed. Now they have to move to Kansas City, where he tried his next endeavor, purchasing two large routes from the Kansas City Star and Kansas City Times, which at the time were both a morning and an evening daily. So he had two routes, one for each, one every morning and one every evening, 7 days a week. And guess who helped him with that? Roy. For 6 years, Roy and Walt Disney woke up at 4:30 every morning, folded papers, delivered papers for their father, went to school, and then came back after school, picked up evening papers, folded them, and delivered those for their father every day. Both of their grades suffered because now they're in middle school and high school, and they're starting to fall asleep in class. They can't hold their eyes open. Even Walt's art suffered. He wasn't drawing as much because he was tired. And Walt also had no money to replace his art supplies. He had been lucky to have, teachers and that retired doctor that would keep him supplied with things, but it wasn't the case in Kansas City because he was working so much. He really wasn't social at school. He was known as those two weird kids that fall asleep in class all the time. So he really had no way of paying for his art supplies. So he decided he would get his own job to so that he could hoard money to pay for his art. And he did that by getting a job at a nearby candy shop in town that he would work every day during the recess and lunchtime. He would work a couple of hours every day for this candy store, and the owner would give him a few pennies, and he would also give him lunch every day, a hot lunch every day. Chili con carne was his favorite, according to Walt, and would give him all the sweets he could eat. So now Walt's getting a few pennies so that he can buy art supplies. He's getting a hot lunch every day, and he's getting all the sweets he wanted. So he's able to indulge in something that his father would never let him. So he said that for the longest time, for that entire 5 or 6 years he worked there, that candy shop was his own little world. And eventually things started to kind of fold in on Walt. He was still doing 2 paper routes a day in addition to the candy shop, and managing to somehow still pass, though barely by the skin of his teeth, and do some art. But he was getting tired. And there was a story in one of the books that I thought was just telling. It was one morning, a Friday, that he and Roy had gone about their route, and he was almost done with his route. He had maybe 3 houses left, and he got to one certain porch, and the sun had just come up. And the sunshine was warm, he said, on his face, and there was a clean space with a mat on the porch, and he said, I can just lay down here and get a few minutes sleep, and no one will ever know. So he did, and then he was awakened when the people came out to get their paper. He realized that he had vastly overslept. He ran, he finished the last 3 houses and took off to school. And of course he was late for school. And he said after that he never really dilly-dallied at work again, but he was just so tired. But during this time, he met a couple of friends that liked to hang out at the local Kansas City railroad yard, and he was really now able to indulge his love of trains. Now, he's getting into his teenage years yet. He's 14, 15, going on 16 at the time. He's able to indulge his love of trains, and he started to draw the trains, and then he started to put faces on the trains. He loved to make things anamorphic. Things that you wouldn't normally see talking, he would make them talk. And so he started drawing faces with trains and things like that. He really loved it. He would spend every minute he could at the rail yard just watching trains and drawing them. Some of these friends that he met were also into film, and they started spending some of their money and going to movies. At the time, the only animation were shorts at the beginning of feature films, and everything was still silent. This was still in the days of silent film. So he fell in love with these movies and the cartoons and the moving pictures, and he was hooked. He wanted to learn more about it. So he actually confessed to Roy and Flora that he wanted to study art. He wanted to study what makes those cartoons move on the big screen. And of course, Flora and Roy encouraged him to pursue it, to read and do everything he could about it to learn. However, of course, Elias told him it was a fool's errand. No need to pursue that. Just concentrate on your schooling and the paper route, because that's what's most important. And for a long time, Roy and Walt did just that. However, one morning while they were folding papers for their route, Roy told him he had joined the Army and would be leaving very soon. Now, Roy was disappointed and scared for two reasons. First of all, his other two brothers were already in the Army, and they had left him, and now his only friend and confidant within the family, outside of his mother, was going to leave too, and World War I was starting to heat up pretty good. So that everybody knew that the U.S. was about to enter it. So hearing Roy say that he was going to join the Army definitely deflated Walt for a while. And after Roy left, he continued to help his father on the route, even though his work was now doubled since Roy was gone. But his mother, with the help of his mother, he was able to take some classes at local Kansas City design schools, the Kansas City Art Institute, to name it. So he started taking some Saturday courses after his route there on drawing, art, and animation. And he also took a cartooning mail correspondence course as well. And he would continue to sell his drawings and work at the candy shop to make a little extra money. Of course, Elias kept all the money from the route, but Walt was able to squirrel away just enough to pay for what he needed, and Elias would take the rest of it. Eventually, though, Elias became disenfranchised, of course, with the newspaper route, and decided it was time to move the family back to Chicago. He sold the newspaper route and moved Flora and Ruth back to Chicago. He did allow Walt to stay for a few months to finish both high school and his high school year and his classes at the Art Institute. He left him with his older brother Raymond, who by now had left the Army and was living near the family in Kansas City. And Walt would say that his years with Raymond, or his months with Raymond, were the best years of his life. It was happiness, no pressure. He really felt as though he was coming into his own. He was also able to get a job as a news butcher at the local pedestrian train station, selling newspapers and snacks, and was able to earn some money there thanks to his Uncle Robert, who knew somebody there, was able to pull some strings. But finally, after the school year ended, his parents sent for him, and the 16-year-old had to move back to Chicago. Just the beginning of 1917, right as the USA were about to enter World War I. And upon moving back to Chicago, he was told by his father, who had invested in a jelly company, the Ozell Jelly Company in Chicago, that now Walt's job was to work at the factory. And he did that. He was miserable working there. He worked the night shift there, but he was able to go to high school and would actually enroll in some day classes and weekend classes at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. But he was under a lot of pressure with work and school and felt that he couldn't please his father no matter what. Also, Roy had come home on leave, and Roy told Walt that the United States were about to enter the World War, and Walt felt that it was his patriotic duty to join and help fight the war. Unfortunately, they wouldn't take him because he was 16. The Army had a cutoff of 17, and he wasn't making it. He was very disappointed, but he wanted to get away from his father. He wanted to be in Europe with his brother, so he decided there must be a way. So he started doing some research and came upon the Red Cross Ambulance Corps that would take people also at age 17. So he came home and told his parents what his plan was. Would they sign for him? And his father said absolutely not. His mother said not only would she sign for him, she would change his date of birth, making it 1900 instead of 1901, thus making him old enough to join the Red Cross Army. Remember, this is before driver's licenses or any form of state ID, so all it took was a simple change on an application. And his mother did that and signed, because as a 17-year-old you had to have a parental signature. And she did that for him, and they faked his age. He was able to join the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. Walt flourished in the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. Not only did he cheer the soldiers and the other ambulance corps members up by painting cartoons on the sides of ambulances and just generally being a great guy to be around. He made lifelong friends, among them Ray Kroc, the McDonald's guy, also served in the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. There were also many, there's an entire list of many great female and male Americans that served in the Red Cross during World War I. Just check that out. There's too many for me to list. But he became friends with Ray Kroc, who was also from Chicago, and also, as I said, cheered many people up by painting anamorphic faces on ambulances. He also started drawing more and sending them home to newspapers to see if he could get published. He was rejected by all the newspapers and magazines stateside, but he was picked up by the Army newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, and they started publishing not only his funny cartoons, but his political cartoons. He loved the Red Cross Ambulance Corps so much that he actually stayed after the war was over to drive around important officials and diplomats while the treaty negotiations were going on. He also picked up the habit of smoking while in Europe, and that was a habit that would end up costing him his life one day. And with that, we're going to leave the section on his background in the early years, and we're going to progress into the 20s and 30s. So let's get started.
Oh boy, my oh my, here's Tracy with part 2.
With that. After leaving the ambulance corps, he of course returned home stateside to find that his parents had left Chicago after the jelly factory had failed, big whoop, and they had actually returned to Kansas City, Missouri area. So he went there to join his family. He was taken aback when he got home to see that how Elias's ways had taken such a toll on his mother and his sister Ruth, and he just said he couldn't fall back into that. He was an adult now. He was close to 20. He was an adult. He didn't need to live under his father's thumb, and it was there that he decided he was going to strike out on his own. He rented a small room in Kansas City and began sending out drawings in the hopes of becoming a political cartoonist, as some of his political cartoons had met rave reviews in the Stars and Stripes. Unfortunately, he couldn't get hired, and he dreaded having to return home to the family home to be under his father's thumb, who would tell him, "I told you so," about art. So he just continued to live hand to mouth, working odd jobs, trying to make it as a cartoonist. He finally found work around the holidays at an actual advertising firm near Kansas City called Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio. They drew advertising for all the major retailers, Sears and Roebuck, JCPenney, all of them. They drew all of their retail advertisements, and so he got a job there and was dutifully employed at the great, wonderful, rich sum of $50 a month. Now, you got to remember, this is the 1920s, so that was a lot of money for a young man. He also met there a guy that would go on to be one of his right hands at Disney and one of his best friends, and that is a young artist by the name of Ub Iwerk. And Ub Iwerk also worked in the art department of Pesman and Rubin, and the two struck it up famously. They started staying late at night after all their work was done and experimenting with different methods to draw. They were still hanging out at the movies and watching the serials, and sound was starting to be experimented with in movies, so they were just wondering what they could do to make their art stand out. So they started staying and using the equipment that the advertising firm had to try out new things. However, after Christmas, in the first week of January, after the Christmas rush was over, they were let go from Pesman and Rubin since there was no longer enough work to sustain them. But because of all the work they had done together, they had established quite a progressive-looking portfolio of art, and they decided that they had what it took to go out and reach out to some of the theaters, some of the retailers, some of the other places that they had gotten to know working with them through Pesman Rubin, that they could actually maybe strike out on their own, and they did that. They rented a small office, and Iwerk's Disney Commercial Artists was born. However, the young men failed to attract just a whole lot of customers. A lot of the theater owners liked what they had, but they didn't really trust it. They said they would rather stick with the stuff coming out of the big distribution houses in New York. New York was the, king land of animation at the time. So they said they would rather stick with what they knew would sell. So they didn't have a whole lot of customers, and they were starting to starve to death. They were living in their small office. So iWorks and Disney agreed that Walt should temporarily leave the firm and start working at the local Kansas City film ad company. And that way that he could earn enough money to sustain them while iWorks continued to look for clients. However, a couple of months later, with the business almost completely gone, iWorks also joined Disney working at the film ad company. And the film ad company did cutout animation. It was a kind of a brand new technique where you could make more definitive lines and make animation stand out. Like the characters actually stand out from the background, and they were pretty innovative at this company, and iWorks and Walt learned a lot. They started to work on a lot of serials that were sold to distribution houses who then sold them to local theaters. There's one called Mutt and Jeff, Coco the Clown. These were all very famous cartoon serials of the day. When I say serial, I mean it's a short cartoon that runs before a feature film, and it's continued. Just like some of the feature films were continued. They would be, shorter features and longer features, but there was always a cliffhanger. Well, the cartoons were just the same. They would be cartoon cliffhangers, and people would have to come the next week to see how it turned out. So it was just kind of film in the 20s. And so they started drawing some of the more famous ones, and they built up quite a portfolio for themselves. They also got into cell animation that was a little more promising than the cutout. It made characters a little more distinct. And then they decided, but as such, Kansas City Film Ad Company didn't really want to branch out that much, and Disney became disenchanted with his work there. But one thing he had met is a new possible business partner in the part of Fred Harmon, who had some money and promised to finance them if they could stake out on their own, which they did. And their new company, under Newman's Laugh-O-Gram Company, was born. And they had one client, the very famous Newman Theater in Kansas City, who bought all of their serials, hence Newman's Laugh-O-Grams, because it was the only theater they were shown in. They did not have a mainstream distribution deal, but it allowed them to show their work. Finally, May 1921, the Newman's Laugh-O-Grams had become so popular and other theaters were showing interest that they rebranded the company as just the Laugh-O-Gram Studio, and they were able to hire more animators, including Ubbs Iwerk, Rudolph Ising, and Fred Hartman's brother, Hugh Hartman, who were actually able to start mass producing their serials for distribution all over the Midwest in theaters, and they were starting to make a name for themselves. However, Disney saw that perhaps even the cell animation that they were working with was going to kind of fall to the wayside as new and better techniques come up. Now, there had been some talk about injecting animated characters into live action features. That was something that had actually been done before. You have an animated character next to a real live person in the real live person's world. But what you did not see was an actual real live flesh and blood person interjected into an animated world with all kinds of animated creatures around them. And this was the vision that Walt Disney had. He felt that he could do this, and it would be such a novelty that people would want it, and they would do really well with it. So he started production of what he at that time considered his magnum opus, Alice's Wonderland, based on Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, not to be confused with the animated feature that the Disney company would do many years in the future, Alice in Wonderland. But it was based pretty similarly on the same story. It didn't take word for word Lewis Carroll's story. There was no Jabberwocky. There was none of that. No Queen of Hearts. No White King. Oh, White Queen, Red Queen, Tweedledee, Tweedledum. None of that, but it used that persona of stepping into an unknown world. Instead of stepping through a looking glass, however, in his early feature, which ended up being a 12-and-a-half-minute one-reel film, the young Alice, played by who would grow to be silent film and later feature film star Virginia Davis, played Alice, who actually started out coming to the Laugh-O-Gram Studios to see some funnies being drawn. And it was a silent film because even though sound was being experimented with, it was still not the mainstream. And so she went to the studio to visit a Walt Disney at the Laugh-O-Gram studio and see him draw. She watches him draw a short serial and immediately goes home. This was actually shot in the Davis home. And her mother puts her to bed, and then she proceeds to dream what would happen, which is her injected into a cartoon world. And I am very fortunate to have found what I think is an open source adaptation of this film, which I'm going to drop right here. Unfortunately, they were not able to find a distribution deal for Alice's Wonderland, so the company ended up slipping into bankruptcy because distribution was now the way to go. They couldn't even really sell their serials to independent theaters anymore. And they realized that they would have to strike a deal with a large distribution company, like Universal, for example, or RKO in New York, that would actually buy all of their stuff and exclusively put them before their movies. But unfortunately, it was too little too late, and they ended up filing bankruptcy in 1923. However, the Harmons and Walt did have one last grasp to try to save Laugh-O-Gram Studios before they completely went down the hole. And they did strike a deal with a distributor in New York City who promised them $11,100 to distribute Alice in Wonderland in front of all of their contracted movie studio movies. However, because they were so needed to make a deal so quickly, when you're scared, you make bad decisions, and they didn't read the contract. And unfortunately, it only promised them $100 up front, and the other $11,000 would be paid several years down the road after so much of the distribution had been finalized. And unfortunately, because of that, the studio did dissolve in 1923, and that distributor went out of business, so they never got the other $11,000. Read contracts, people. Read contracts. After the dissolution of the company, Walt still had a lease on their studio space, so he ended up living in their studio space, selling art on the street, doing odd jobs, whatever he could to to survive, contemplating his next move. And while in that studio, he had a pet mouse. He adopted a field mouse that had wandered in, and that became his longtime friend, Mortimer. And that mouse, I think you know, would go on to be one of the biggest influences in Walt's life, but that would come later. In late 1923, he finally made the agonizing decision that he had to go where the action was. Even though the king land of animation was still New York City, his run-in with the New York City distribution company that had basically ended his company left him pretty sour on the Big Apple. So he decided to go the other way to L.A., where the actual feature films were made, and to hope to strike some sort of deal there. So he took everything he had. He sold his motion picture camera, had enough money in his pocket to move to L.A. because he also had Uncle Robert Disney living out there, as well as his brother Roy, who had finally been discharged from the Army, was recovering from what people say was tuberculosis in a hospital out there and was about to be discharged. So he sold everything he had. He took his 12-minute reel of Alice's Wonderland, his art supplies, his clothes, and Mortimer, and boarded a train heading for Los Angeles. He visited Roy in the hospital, set up shop, living with his Uncle Robert, and set about trying to find a job. He went from studio to studio with Alice's Wonderland and could not find any bites. So he started doing odd jobs. Roy was finally discharged from the hospital and also moved in with Uncle Robert, and Roy took a job selling vacuums door to door, and he wanted Walt to do it too to help them save some money, and Walt almost did. He almost became a door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesman. But then he got a call that would change his life forever, from Margaret Winkler, one of the first women to ever rise to the top of being a film and cartoon distributor in New York City. She was over one of the largest firms. He had, on a whim, way back when he was looking for distributors in New York, sent her a copy of Alice's Wonderland, and she finally looked at it, liked it, because it was unique, that you didn't just put human people in cartoon land, and that just wasn't done. I mean, this is way before Who Framed Roger Rabbit. You didn't do that. So it was just really groundbreaking, and she liked it and wanted to distribute it and wanted him to make more based on it. So he went and told Roy, "Put down your vacuum. We got a real business prospect here, and I want you to come on and help me run the business side of it." And they borrowed $500 from Uncle Robert and opened a studio to start working on expanding Alice's Wonderland. Now, Margaret did not like the title. She thought it kind of put it into a box that it couldn't get out of, so they changed the name from Alice's Wonderland to the Alice Comedies. He hired back Ubbs Iwerks, who he brought out from Kansas City, and also hired 3 colorists to help them do the in-between shots. Like, they would draw and these colorists would color. He also contacted Virginia Davis, the original star of the short, and her parents, and they came out to California to enable Walt to film her to make the rest of the series. Now, I mentioned that he'd hired some colorists. Well, women were just now starting to even think about getting into the workplace outside of teaching and nursing. So they hired a lot of female colorists because they could get them cheaper. I mean, that's the only way. There's no other way to say that. This was still a little bit prior to women's. This is barely 3 years past the passage of the 19th Amendment. So women had the right to vote, but had not yet achieved any semblance of equality in the workplace, so he could get women cheaper. But he was good to his employees. He fed them. He even would carpool and drive them home, pick them up, bring them to work, and drive them home every day. And it was among these colorists, there was 3 of them, was a young woman by the name of Lillian Bounds. And she was a young woman from Lewiston, Idaho, that had moved to L.A. to live with her aunt, who also worked for Disney as a colorist. And Walt took a shine to her, and he would make sure she was the first one picked up every morning and the last one dropped off every day so that he could hang out with her and spend some time with her. Well, I don't think you have to be too much of a guest to say that a young romance developed, and they were married in late 1925, just a few months after he had hired her. They actually went home to her hometown of Blueston, Ohio, where they were married and were generally happy. Now we're going to take a little bit of a segue here and talk about Walt Disney and his family, because the rest of the story, of course, gets overridden with all of his work achievements. But they tried for many, many years to have a baby, and Lillian had several miscarriages, and Walt was about at the end of his rope with that. It was destroying him, but finally, in December, ironically, of 1933, their daughter Diane Disney was born. And 3 years later, 1936, after several more miscarriages, they openly adopted their daughter, Sharon Disney. Now, who was 6 weeks old at the time that they got her. Now, they did not hide adoption, as had been the fashion before. They openly talked about her being adopted because they wanted to promote adoption because of the terrible childhood that Walt had. They really wanted, unwanted or abused children to be able to find better homes. And so they really talked about adoption before adoption was a thing. So that's how they did their part. Now, as far as putting their children in the limelight, they did not. They kept them very private. They kept them hidden from the public, but they did talk about adoption openly. So they had a very unique childhood. He built wonderful things for them in their backyard. They lived in around Hollywood, and including one of the largest model train sets ever. Now, that was more for Walt than for his daughter, but their backyard was literally a wonderland that would be, later on, as you can imagine, would become building block for Disneyland. In late 1925, Charles Misk, who had married Margaret Winkler, had taken over more duties at the distribution house and was kind of growing tired of the Alice comedies. So he asked them to branch out, and could they do more of an anamorphic animal character to compete with some of the other, namely Felix the cat, who was by far the most popular serial cartoon character out there. Could you create something that would kind of compete with him? And so Walt came up with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And Oswald became all the rage. Even though he kind of looks like Felix the cat with long ears, he became a huge competitor for Felix, and he went on to well into the 1930s, 1938, when the last Oswald the Lucky Rabbit serial was formed. So he did outlast Felix, which ended about 1930. And they were exclusively distributed by Universal, who Charles Misk had a partnership deal with, and so all of the cartoons that he distributed went to Universal Films. However, in 1926, even with the success of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, Winkler kind of stepped out of the limelight a little bit. She was ready to just kind of go home and retire. So Mintz took over, and Mintz was kind of a ass. I mean, he was definitely a hard-nosed Madison Avenue type of businessman. He wanted to make more Oswald, but wanted to make Oswald for less. And so over the years between the months between 1926 and 1927, he slowly started to speak to the artists at Walt and Roy's studio that were creating Oswald and other cartoons as well, and sort of started to kind of peel them away a little bit, talk to how he was starting his own animation studio and how he could pay them more, and was setting the stage for what was to come in February of 1928, when Walt realized that Mintz was taking most of the profits from Oswald and he should be getting a bigger fee. So he took a train from Los Angeles all the way to New York to negotiate with Mintz and asked for a larger fee. Mintz told him that not only would he not be getting a larger fee, he would be getting less. And if he wanted to continue to have Oswald as a character, because again, Walt and Roy didn't read the contract, they essentially in the contract had signed the character of Oswald over to Mintz and Universal Studios. So now Oswald doesn't even belong to him anymore. So if they continued to want to actually be participating with Oswald, they would take less money. Well, Walt said absolutely not. And well, Mintz said, well, too bad you don't have a studio anymore, because every single one of your artists, except Ubbs Iwerks and Lillian's aunt as colorists, had decided to work for Mintz, who was forming his own studio because he could pay them more, yet pay less for Oswald. So basically, Roy and Walt were cut out of their second big creation, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And on that very long train ride from New York back to LA, Walt telegrammed Lillian and told them that everything, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. Yet he sat on that train and started to sketch. And he drew a mouse that reminded him of Mortimer. And he said Mortimer Mouse would be his next big serial. And when he got home, he showed it to Lillian, he showed it to Ubbs, he showed it to Roy, and said, this is Mortimer. This is our next big star. And Lily said, makes him sound pompous. That's a horrible name. Why not Mickey? Everybody thought Mickey could work. And so the King, the greatest cartoon character to ever walk the face of the earth, was born. The wonderful, legendary Mickey Mouse. Outside of Walt's initial drawing from the train, it was actually Ubbs Iwerks that gave Mickey his distinct early look, with the shorts, with the buttons, and the skinny arms, kind of reminiscent of both Oswald and Felix the Cat. His ears, those distinctive ears, all the way up to his cap. And it was Iwerks that literally refined the drawing of Mickey. But Walt considered Mickey an homage to Mortimer and to the childhood that he hoped every child would have. And he was dead set on the fact that Mickey would be the first, when sound was actually developed that he could get his hands on, and those processes were actually in place, Mickey would be the first cartoon character to speak. And so Mickey Mouse's first appearance was in May of 1928 in a short called Plain Crazy. It did fairly well. Some people, distributors did pick it up. It did fairly well, but the second feature was The Galloping Gaucho, which was not picked up by any distributors at all. So Mickey was dead for just a little while. However, because of the success of The Jazz Singer in 1927, which was an early talkie, it had not only music overlays, it had synchronized singing where the characters would actually lip sync to the beat of the song, the lyrics of the song, and even had some spoken word. So it was because of that he knew he could do something similar. He could produce a Mickey short that had synchronized music, synchronized movement of lips, and synchronized speech. And I don't think you need to know what happened in late 1928 as a result of that. Steamboat Willie came out as Disney's first appearance in Mickey Mouse with a voice, voiced by Walt Disney himself, because he couldn't find anybody that brought Mickey to life as well as he did when it came to a voice. And as a wonderful up yours to Charles Mintz, Disney actually bypassed Mintz and went straight to Pat Powers, who was a pioneer at Universal Studios, and offered him the right to all of the Mickey Mouse cartoons coming out if he would help him use his Cinephone system to actually add the sound. Universal bit. And they actually threw Walt to one of their other distributors, Cinephone, who became the mainstay for all Disney's early sound cartoons, which not only like Steamboat Willie, others became really, really popular. And their brand new series, Silly Symphonies, was born, which became the #1 leading serial for much of the 1920s and 1930s. Their 1929 Skeleton Dance, which was simply 4 skeletons jumping out in a graveyard and doing some really cool dance moves. I'll put a still here. And it was actually drawn by Works and Disney and became one of the most popular cartoons of all time, one of the first animated series to win an Oscar. In 1930, however, Disney, he and Roy felt that they were still not receiving the right amount of profits from Silly Symphonies and Mickey. So he decided to meet with iWorks and urge iWorks to only do the main shots and hire some lower level animators to do the in-between shots to save money. iWorks didn't want to do that. He said it lowered the quality of the project. So Disney, not wanting to upset his artist, he went to Powers at Cinephone and Universal and asked him, could we not receive a bigger cut of the money for Silly Symphonies? And unfortunately, Powers would not do it, as most executives wouldn't. He refused and actually signed iWorks away from Disney to work for him, hoping that that would indeed crush the Disney studio. And in 1931, as a result of everything that was going on, Disney had a nervous breakdown in October of 1931. And he blamed it on Powers, iWorks, and the fact that he was just overworked. Lillian took him away to an extended holiday where they cruised to Cuba, Panama, and just kind of got away from it all. And he left Roy to deal with the shenanigans. And somehow, Roy managed to renegotiate and keep Mickey and Silly Symphonies in Disney Studios. But they lost their distributor, Universal and Cinephone. So Roy went to Columbia Pictures, and they gladly picked up the distribution rights to Mickey Mouse and Silly Symphonies. And as a result, they continued on, and he set his sights on color. He had mastered sound, now he set his eyes on color and the new Technicolor process. In fact, when Walt Disney came back from his extended vacation in early 1932, they were already almost done with the animated short Flowers and Trees, which would be another Oscar winner. And he decided to scrap it, start over, and use the Technicolor process and reproduce the entire cartoon as color, which he did. And in 1935, it won an Academy Award for Best Animated Short. And from Flowers and Trees, which was first produced in 1932 and 1933, all Silly Symphonies and Mickey Mouse cartoons were forever in color. And there's a long list of great ones that have won honorary and official Oscars, such as The Three Little Pigs, based on his old buddy Porker, Flowers and Trees, all of them. Color became the mainstay, and realized that animation was a great way of telling a story, that it didn't necessarily just have to be real life people telling a story. And so he set himself on the path to produce the first feature-length animated film ever. And Disney, the Disney brothers, ushered in what would be forever be known as the golden age of animation, running from 1934 to 1938. Walt Disney Studios worked on their first full-length animated film. I don't think I need to tell you what it is. It is my favorite Disney film of all time, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. They did it in color, and there was actually a brand new colorization method that came out halfway into the production, and they stopped and went back and redid all the earlier scenes in the new technique because he wanted it to be the best. The film cost an unprecedented $1.5 million, which would be the cost of a Marvel movie today. I mean, it is just absolutely insane that they would spend that much on a cartoon. But he was for sure that he could usher in a brand new age of entertainment, and people would sit through a full-length cartoon and not just as a small 10-minute short. In 1937, Snow White premiered, and it was one of the highest grossing movies of that year. It made $6.5 million in 1937. That's a tremendous achievement. It won both actual Oscars and honorary Oscars. Walt Disney was honored at the 1938 Academy Awards and the 1939 Academy Awards as well, where they presented in 1939 him an Oscar consisting of one large Oscar and 7 smaller Oscars for his achievements with Snow White. And the money from Snow White really set the Disney Studios on the right track. They were able to take care of all their debt. They were able to give both Roy, Walt, and their family — Roy had married by this time too — good places to live in Hollywood. And he was actually able to move his parents, Elias and Flora, from Missouri to a brand new house in North Hollywood near Burbank, and put them up in a brand new house near 2 of their sons. However, in 1938, tragedy would strike when Elias and Flora had complained several times that they smelled gas in their new house, and Roy and Walt had sent repairmen over. However, toward the end of that year, Elias found his wife unconscious on the floor, and the cause of death was asphyxiation from gas inhalation. Flora Disney, the one nurturing parent that Walt had, died as a result of a gas leak in a house he bought her. And Walt was never the same after that. She was buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, and where later Elias, when he died in 1941, would also be interred. And many people think this is why, for films moving forward, there were already 2 films in production at Walt Disney Studios, 2 animated films. Pinocchio and Fantasia were already almost finished, and we're going to talk about them. But the next animated one that would come out would be both Dumbo and Bambi. And in both of those pictures, you had what? A child separated from their mother. And it was because they thought it was Walt's grief that led him to do that. He wasn't just being a jerk, y'all. He was in some pain, and he was trying to work out his pain. Fantasia was actually just supposed to be a small short by the name of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which featured Mickey Mouse and classical music. And it was literally just supposed to be an animated short that would run before a feature. However, at a party in Los Angeles, Walt Disney came face to face with the world-famous Tchaikovsky, who said he would love to work on the featurette and conduct the orchestra. And when Tchaikovsky says that he will conduct your orchestra and possibly write some melodies for it, you take him up on that offer and you make it last as long as you can. And as a result, The Sorcerer's Apprentice became part of the epic animation classical music compilation of Fantasia. However, neither Pinocchio or Fantasia did that well at the theater for several reasons, but mostly because World War II was starting to gear up. You had the Nazis doing Nazi stuff in Europe in 1939, and as a result, a lot of European distribution deals were lost, and that included a great extent Walt Disney's business. So it only had domestic sales and North American sales to kind of count on, and unfortunately, it didn't work out too well. And with that, we're going to end the first major part of the Walt Disney story at the beginning of World War I and the 1940s. And tomorrow we will pick up with essentially part 3 of the story, the 40s and the 50s, and then from there, the late 50s and the 60s. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly have. I'll see you real soon. Until next time, Keto Comic.